Okay, in this video today, we're going to talk about the first of the two chapters that were slated for discussion last Thursday or yesterday, chapter 2. But I would like to start off talking a little bit about your teaching practicum that you're going to have. As you can see here on BlazeView, you have many helpful links for information. You have the school calendar. That's something that you're going to have to consider when going for your teaching practicum. You also have a Google Maps link to the Head Start location, as well as address and contact information, guidelines for your lesson plans, and a lesson plan basic format, which should help you when you are working with your partner to put together a lesson. Now, I have sent everyone an email, one about the fingerprinting issue that has just come up this fall. So if you haven't been fingerprinted and don't have any documentation for that, then you're going to need to go to one of the locations that are linked here to be fingerprinted officially and have that on you at all times. The other email that I've sent is with the pairings for the teaching on Mondays, and probably what I'm thinking they'll say is Tuesdays would be the other day, but I've left that up to the center director to let us know, and whether it would be Tuesdays or Thursdays for those of you that are thinking of doing it on those days. Um, so we'll have to wait to hear back from her. And given all of the interruptions in school service with the inclement weather, we're just running a little bit off schedule with this. And I'm thinking that they're probably going to want us to start not this coming week, but the next week, the second week in February. So we'll have a chance to talk about that in person as well. Um, so you have a lot of different resources here. The Georgia Teacher Keys evaluation is what I would use when I come into your class, with the knowledge that you're only teaching for 15 to 30 minutes, so you're not able to teach a whole lesson. So that's something that we have to keep in mind when we're observing each other for this reason. You also have the new standards for the 4-year-old pre-K classroom and some videos to watch regarding that. So all of these things can be really helpful for you as you begin that. Notice that when we click on the guidelines for lesson plans, one of the things you're going to need to do is prepare with your partner about where the location is, when you're going to arrive, and a basic knowledge of the kind of things you're going to present over the next weeks. So you want to just have an idea in your head. Today we're going to talk about colors. Next week we're going to talk about numbers, things like that, or the kind of songs you might want to present. And you're going to want to review these things at this link here that I just also showed you on BlazeView. Both of these things are linked on BlazeView. So be sure to read this information carefully, and also note that you need to arrive by 9 a.m. Your visits will be from 9:15 to 9:45. However, the kids are going to be coming back from breakfast around 9 a.m., so you want to be in there ready to go by 9:15, because you only have 30 minutes. And these teachers have things very tightly structured for the kids because, as you'll see, things need to be very well laid out and scheduled for kids this age. So if you're not there on time, ready to start at 9:15, then that presents a problem both for the teachers and the students. So you need to be there by 9 o'clock. So be sure to read this over very carefully. And then if you look in this module as well, you have a lesson plan basic format. As I said, I really do think that we will have time to go over this before your first lesson, because I don't think they're going to be ready for us to come in until the second week in February. Um, at any rate, your first lesson is really going to be just getting to know the kids, getting to know your teacher in the classroom, maybe learning my name is, things like that. So it's really just going to be an introductory lesson, but I don't think they're going to be ready for us to come in this coming week. Okay, so if we go back, let's talk a little bit about creating an environment for communication in the younger learner classroom. And this, what we're really talking about here is enabling students to be active constructors of meaning. And if you remember last week, we talked about constructing meaning and negotiating meaning, how we can use language to really come across with something that is a relevant message for a student to either communicate to us or to hear from us. And that could be something as simple as, yes, this circle is yellow. Or it could be, your learners get older, it could be something more complicated than that. A daily journaling exercise, for example. So what we really want for them is to be active and effective communicators. If we revisit these standards, the standards that we talked about from ACTFL, the 5 C's, as sometimes we'll call them, communication is our main goal. Grammar is one part of the ability to communicate. Certainly, if you don't have your grammatical structures correct, it's very hard to relay a message or to understand a message. So that is important, but it shouldn't be our only focus. And you can see here in the ACTFL standards, we also talk about communities, comparisons, connections with other disciplines, and cultures as well. So communication is the means by which we can bring all these things together and really help our students to be active learners. So if we're prioritizing meaningfulness in our language classroom, we see that language learning is most effective when learners have motivation to learn, when the learning material is relevant. Why should they be learning this? Why should I care if I can say all my colors in Spanish? We have to make it relevant to them. When they have interest in it, when we create an interesting classroom environment, and when they have the need to communicate in the target language. And that's something that we create for them by making an enriched classroom environment. And we'll talk a little bit about how to do that in just a moment. When we give them a good context where things aren't just randomly pulled out of the air that we're talking about. And when we're very clear about our expectations, we can set high expectations, but we have to be clear about them. And our context will then allow them to identify patterns, make connections, and link new info to background info. And that all goes back to the ideas of storage and recall and the cognitive schemata that we were talking about last week. The idea that you have cognitive pathways in your brain that all link up together, and we have to be able to associate old knowledge with new knowledge. So when we talk about communicative competence, what does that mean? There are several elements that come together here. The first one that we can talk about is discourse competence. So knowing how to connect ideas and maintaining a conversational context. In other words, being able to maintain a conversation in the target language. Another one would be sociolinguistic competence, or the appropriate language usage according to your social context. And of course, grammatical competence. Again, if you don't have the right grammar to convey your message or to be understood, then it makes it very hard to maintain that communication. And then you have strategic competence, and this is the ability to use different methods of understanding, negotiation of meaning, ways to make yourself understood or to be understood by someone else. So those 4 elements play a big part in communicative competence. And so you can see we're trying to get at it from very different levels as well. And I would say that under socio-linguistic competence, one really big element is culture. What are the cultural norms for the language that you're trying to communicate in? So a lot of times we can lose fact of what the meaning of the word communicative really is. So if we consider the following scenarios from a fifth grade class, that's been studying clothes and adjectives, including colors and physical traits, which one is actually communicative? Take a moment to read both and think about which one is actually communicative and how does each focus on grammatical functions in different ways. So we see in the first scenario here, we have a teacher showing a picture of a family from Mexico, which can be a really great way to show cultural content to a class. And they have a list of adjectives, and then they have to write a short paragraph for homework. And then they're asked to share their paragraphs with at least 3 other students in the class the next day. But in scenario 2, students are actually paired in groups of 2, and they're asked to describe in simple sentences a person or a family that's important to them. And that family can be their own, someone else's, or even a celebrity. So they're given some latitude in choosing who they want to describe. And the other student has to try to draw the family from the descriptions given. After sharing the drawing, students then have to say, okay, in simple sentences, okay, no, this was brown hair, or this was a green shirt, things like that. And then students switch roles. So in scenario 2, we have a very different kind of communication. Students are given something that's interesting and relevant to them. Probably they're going to want to describe their own family or celebrity that they really like. And the other student is active. They have to do something with the information that the first student is giving them. And then they have to switch roles and they have to then say, okay, no, this is what I said. Even if their language is broken, they don't have all of the language to do it. They're asked to use the L2 to complete a task together. So we call this task building activities, where they have information gaps, and so they're having to use the language together. In scenario 1, you have students, yes, they're using the grammar that's being taught in the class and they're practicing their writing. However, they're just working in the presentational mode, really, because they're just telling their paragraphs to other students in class. They're not asked to get any feedback, they're not asked to share any information, and the students that are listening to them aren't actually asked to do anything with the information. So we see those elements of motivation, relevance, interest, need, context, clarity, all of those things coming into play in scenario 2. So if we look on page 33 through 34 of your book, take a moment to do so and identify the characteristics that have been associated with non-communicative environments. We see that we have an emphasis on recitation, but not in a helpful or constructive way. So just lists of words without any context, maybe, or only labeling things in the classroom and not really bringing them into that contextual, meaningful, rich environment. Using one word language with students, which, as we talked about, caretaker speech really isn't simplified language, it's just language that is targeted for developmentally appropriate usage. Memorized patterns or dialogues that don't really have a specific purpose or relevance for the children. And that comes out of the movements in the 1970s for language learning. Um, Same thing goes for songs, rhymes, or poems, which are amazing ways to teach language, but if they're used out of context, then they lose that meaning for students. And then also reading aloud for recitation and not for meaning for the students. So if they're just simply saying the words, yes, pronunciation is a good thing, but if that's all they're doing all the time, they're not trying to associate any kind of meaning, then it loses its value for the students. We also see a pervasive use of English in the non-communicative environment. We see it when it's used for discipline, for giving directions, for clarifying messages that are originally delivered in the L2, for checking comprehension, or for teaching culture. And so if you look at each one of these things, this is very, very important, because when we can teach students, younger students, basic commands for discipline or giving directions or for checking comprehension in the L2, then that's a way for us to communicate something that they need to know, and a way for them to communicate something that we might need to know, that they feel like we might need to know. So once they have those tools to actually give meaningful communication, such as everyone line up, or everyone stand up, everyone sit down, giving directions like that, then, or it's time to be quiet now for discipline, things like that, then those are the ways that we communicate things that students feel like they actually need to know, things that are a key part of the classroom environment. So you're creating a context-rich environment for them by teaching them key elements of what they would do during the classroom day. During your teaching practice now, that might not be something that you're able to do depending on your cooperating teacher. But if you are having a classroom that is your own, where you have space to do these things, and that is one of the best ways that you can tell students that this is what we are going to use to communicate in this class. One Another thing to think about here is clarifying messages originally delivered in the L2, and we'll talk about translation here in just a moment. But we don't ever want to come back to the space where we say something in the target language and then come back and repeat it in English or the L1, whatever that may be, immediately, because students are just going to wait for that. They're not going to pay any attention to the target language. And then finally, for teaching culture, what we should have to learn to do as foreign language teachers is to infuse culture into everything that we do. So teaching culture shouldn't be separate from teaching language. And we talked a little bit, we had some joking about Taco Day, or Crepe Day in French, and that shouldn't be what we're doing here. We should have things about the culture of our language infused in everything that we do, such as using songs and rhymes and poems in a context-rich environment that can help us teach our children about culture as well as language at the same time. So how do we create this communicative environment? First of all, a meaningful use of language means that we connect L2 learning with a regular curriculum. So we need to be aware of what the students are learning in a general sense at other times of the day. And that's why under your teaching practicum part of Blazeview, there are many resources about learning standards for that age group, because we want to be able to connect it to whatever else they're learning about. As teachers, we also need to advocate for long-term foreign language instruction. So no matter what level you're teaching, we need to be able to say that this should extend longer. It should start earlier and extend longer. We need to prepare and promote activities that are developmentally appropriate, but that also allow students to showcase their learning. So not only are they held responsible for what they're doing, but they're also able to show off what they did. And even at the youngest level, we need to ensure an exchange of information. Once again, we're creating an environment where students need to tell us something in the L2, and we need to tell them things in the L2, and they see how important it is to use and how relevant. And we can do that by surrounding our experiences with language. We can connect with other teachers about learning experiences that they're having in their classes, such as the gym class. Maybe there's something that you could do that connects with the gym class as far as dancing and singing goes, or the art class even would be or the music class. Those are all excellent ways to connect their language learning with other subjects. We need to create hands-on experiences for students this age. It's very important for students to be able to physically experience what they're learning at this age. The one thing that we need to remember here is that you oftentimes will have a variety of cultural backgrounds in your classes, and or physical needs of the students. So in your book, they talk about making crepes or different kinds of food in your classroom, but you also need to remember that perhaps a student is allergic to a certain item and that you're using to make those, or maybe it's a time for fasting in their family, things like that. So you have to be really sensitive to that. But those hands-on experiences where we're using water, sand, things like that, and yes, if appropriate, food items are invaluable for teaching our students things about language. Hands-on experiences can also involve movement activities. The block activity that we talked about in the last class period would be an excellent time to have that hands-on experience that connects different types of lessons. We also can involve community members, and this is really great to have people from the community come into your class and talk about different types of things. And the only thing to remember here is you need to observe all safety directives. So you need to check with your school well beforehand to make sure that you are following any directives that they might have about community members coming into the classroom. Another thing that students at this age really need is a focus on grace and courtesy lessons, more or less social conventions. They're still learning those, even in their first language. So this is a great place for you to really create a context-rich environment. When we say thank you, we say gracias or merci instead of saying thank you, but we always are sure to do that. Things like that. Um, that you can create a rich environment in your classroom with, and that also helps them in the larger social learning environment that school is for children of this age. You can also establish connections with older students as volunteering opportunities, reading buddies, things like that. Again, you have to observe all the safety directives of both schools, both levels of schools, but this is a great way to bring in peers as mentors for students and give them that modeling. And another way we can do that is when students model excellent efforts, offer praise and use them as a model. Say thank you so much, for using that word. And you say it, of course, in your target language, but you want to praise them. But the other thing that we have to be careful with here is we have to be sure to involve all the students. So we can't just focus on one student over and over and over. You want to find a way to make sure that every student exhibits a behavior that you can say, that was excellent, very good. We also want to involve parents with specific information about lessons and tips for promoting learning. A lot of this is now being done through technology, which I'm going to speak about in the next video, but we want to make sure that parents are up to date with why the children are learning a foreign language, and also how can they help to create a communicative environment in their own home, even if they don't speak the target language. So maybe some labeling around the house, or maybe learning to say merci instead of thank you at home, back and forth with the parents. Those kinds of things can be very helpful. Maybe introducing one tip like that every week, giving them a weekly review sheet, things like that. A lot of elementary school teachers are using tools like Twitter and Facebook to get these messages across to parents in a safe and secure environment. So those are little ways that you can involve the parents in the students' learning. And we can also always at this age utilize directed ludic behavior. That means ludic means things that are structured around the notion of play, learning through play. So structured games and plays with props instead of just reciting a dialogue, but having students really feel the context of what you're doing, but in a very structured way. And if you look on pages 36 through 39, we can see that here you can see all different kinds of examples of how that can be done in a structured way so that students are actually taking something away from it rather than just repeating words. And once again, always remember that your teaching of language should always be infused with culture. So if we talk about the language culture connection, and we did do this a little bit last week, and this is something that you're going to hear over and over. Language and culture are inherently connected, and we cannot quote unquote divorce them. And another thing to remember is students and teachers usually have very different ideas about what culture is, and I think parents probably come into play too at this age, and how important it is and how connected it is to the language. So it's important to really listen to your audience, whether that be other teachers, your students in your classroom, depending on their age, their parents, things like that, and really try and help them understand how connected language and culture are and how they can be infused together. But remember that even if you're not a native speaker, you carry cultural and linguistic knowledge into the classroom whenever you get in there. So you have the ability to bring those two things together. And cultural information is often one of the best contexts for language learning at any level. So we can take an example of a French song that is called Alouette, um, where the context is a little bit um, different, we'll say, but it does talk about the different parts of the body in the song so that we can take each verse then and learn about the different parts of the body. And it's a classic French children's song that then we can talk about different things about why it's important. That's one example of a context that culture gives us, is a classic children's song that we can talk about the culture surrounding it and also the different parts of the body that it introduces. So what are our basics for balancing this target language goal and student comprehension? As we talked about before, no translation. Don't follow up the L2 usage with translation in L1 because students will just build expectations of this and wait for the easy L1 language to come after. And you want to make sure to positively reinforce students who call out translations, because a lot of times kids this age will get really excited because they know what you mean and they'll call out, oh, that means go. And you want to say, oh, thank you. You want to reinforce the fact that they knew it, and you want to reward their curiosity and their enthusiasm, but also discourage this behavior, perhaps by saying, thank you so much in the target language, and then you might say in English, let's try it in Spanish next time. So you want to discourage it in a kind way. And you also want to use the target language to teach and enforce classroom behavior models with signs, signals, etc. So again, standing up, using your hands to raise, get everybody to stand up, much like a choir director would do. Having signs that are printed out that say lunch, things like that, that you could use to just hold up. It says lunch in the target language, and students, if you have explained to them, we're going back to that clarity principle. If we have explained to them that when I hold up this sign, this is what you should do, then you don't have to use English to say everybody stand up and line up for lunch. You want to continually monitor that L2 use and comprehension. Um, we spoke last week about comprehensive input and how it's important to give your students a lot of input, and they're not going to understand all of it, not at all. But and sometimes to them it'll just seem like you're up there babbling, and that's okay, as long as we make sure that they're understanding the basic things. And if you remember the example with the pen, how I was going over and over on and on about the pen, when all I wanted you to understand was the word for pen. So make sure they're retaining what they need for the lesson by using multiple methods of comprehension. So you're using images, visuals, movements. You can ask them for thumbs up, thumbs down, choral responses, drawings or signs, asking for volunteers or group activities so that students, that's a really wonderful thing for students who are a little bit older, because that allows them to get comfortable with what they're doing before they have to present it in front of the class. And you also want to build a constructive environment. So when possible, a lot of times foreign language teachers unfortunately don't have their own classroom, but if you do, then you can surround students with images and labels in a constructive way, so that once again you can point to them, you can use them in your teaching so that students are seeing the words as they're needed, not just having them around. But it is important to use the L2 consistently. It's always important, even if everything is not understood. So a lot of times in my French classes, I will just be thinking aloud outside in French, um, just talking in French, but emphasizing those essential words. As long as we are making sure that the point of the lesson, again, the example of the pen, the stylo, is a great example of this, or the table also was a good example. Visuals and gestures are priority number one. That's why I always have PowerPoints in my classes, and you probably won't have or need to use PowerPoints at this level of foreign language teaching for P through 8 learners, but having visuals all around the classroom that you then bring in and incorporate into the lesson is invaluable. Also, for this level of learning, routines and predictability help associate meaning with activities and objects. So kids at this age, they need routines, they need predictability. That's one reason why it's so essential for you to be ready to teach, ready to go at 9:15, because at the Head Start Center, because kids need to know that this is going to happen at this time. I start circle time at 9:15, so I sit down. So there's no confusion about what needs to happen at 9:15. That's something that then takes away any kind of confusion there, and you're already ready to go. Kids know they come in, they sit down for circle time, and this is what's going to happen then. So you don't have to waste instructional time. And that's true for teaching in the L1 or teaching in the L2. Kids just need that routine time to help them structure their day. And then you can use that to say in the target language, because they already know they're going to sit down, let's say. You can use that in the target language to say, okay, everybody sit down. And they're hearing that target language, and it's associated with something that they already know what to do. We want to also carefully use that caretaker speech and functional chunks of language. And remember that caretaker speech is not simplified to the point where it's incomplete, but it's adapted to a developmentally appropriate level. So we may be talking about this is yellow, or we may be talking about this man is tall. So those are still simple sentences, but they are complete sentences. And we can also use functional chunks of language to allow students to use the L2 for normal routines, even if they don't understand the background of how the phrase is formed. And a great example of this is in French, the phrase qu'est-ce que c'est? What is it? That's something that we could really use a lot, even at the pre-K 4-year-old level. What is it? Is it a circle? Is it a triangle? Is it a chair? Things like that. But is a student going to understand how that phrase is formed? No. Students at that level probably won't even be able to read it. But we can teach them how it sounds. We can teach them how it sounds, and then we can use that to help our lessons. So we're teaching them a chunk of language. And then later on in their language studies, they may be able to understand how that's formed. But it allows to it allows us to communicate in basic manners. So if you look on page 44, take a moment to do that. How do we make the language comprehensible? Take a moment to really look over the 4 key elements here. We have the simple direct language, the caretaker speech. And we're choosing to incorporate vocabulary and structures that we can either model or show to the students. So if I'm talking about apples or something that's red, I might have an apple on hand. We're going to break things down into small incremental steps. And again, number 3, making lavish use of the concrete materials, visuals, and gestures. The more the better. Just overload your learners with those things. And number 4, we want to model every step of the process or the directions being presented. We can do exaggerated gestures, and sometimes that might feel a little bit weird to us, but those are going to help the learners to really stick meaning with the action and the language that is associated with it. And we can see too on pages 43 through 44, sometimes English or whatever your L1 is can be appropriate. So what are the roles of English in the foreign language classroom? We want to always be intentional about it. It should never be something that you just slip into. And you should balance the use of the L2 for communicative purposes. So those things like let's all sit down or let's all stand up, let's all line up for lunch. If you're using a lot of gestures and visuals and signs and signals, things like that, with the necessity to impart important information. So for example, if we're needing to practice a fire drill, that's not going to be something you want to do in the L2, obviously. Or if you're explaining something about maybe a field trip or something like that, not something you want to do in the L2. And as we spoke about last week, we want to shoot for 90 to 95% of target language usage in our classes. So again, I cannot stress to you how important those visuals and those gestures are going to be in doing that. And you're going to be giving them a lot of input. They may not understand all of it, but giving them that input, letting them hear the cadence of the language, vocabulary words that they may not get right away, but if we're focusing on really just 1 or 2 little words and they're getting that, then that's what's really important. So I really encourage you to look over pages 43 and 44 regarding what questions you should ask yourself before using the L1 in the classroom. And really think thoughtfully about the kind of things that, like, can I find a way to communicate this in the target language, even if it has to be super simplified, really broken down? Can I simplify the concept or the information? Can I use visuals, things like that? Can I substitute a different concept? If it's too hard for you to communicate it with visuals and gestures in the target language, then maybe the concept isn't developmentally appropriate. So really go through those questions. A lot of the most successful teachers I've known at this level have had questions like those on a sheet that they can easily access, and then go back when they're planning their lessons and say, okay, and look through those questions and say, okay, let me direct myself in another way. If you find yourself slipping into the L1 during your lessons, a lot of times really successful teachers will then take some time after the lesson to go back and reflect on why that happened and how it could have been prevented for the next lesson that they do. So that's our chapter 2 lesson. I'm going to break it up. We're also slated to look over chapter 14. I'm going to break that up because of my internet problems so I can load this video hopefully up online right now. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to let me know.